3 hours into a DEA Schedule 2 audit spreadsheet when my phone buzzed on the corner of my desk. It was a Tuesday morning. Coffee still hot. The kind of morning where you think the biggest problem you'll face is a mismatched NPI number on a controlled substance log. The text was from my supervisor's assistant. She asked if I was free at 2 o'clock for a brief alignment meeting. Those 2 words, alignment meeting, sat in my stomach like a stone. In 22 years of hospital pharmacy work, I had never once been invited to an alignment meeting that ended with anyone feeling aligned. I typed back that I was available and set my phone face down on the desk. I kept working. My name is not important for this story. What matters is what I held, what I knew, and what happened when the people who decided I was replaceable finally understood the difference between those 2 things. I was 54 years old. I had spent the better part of 3 decades building a career in hospital pharmacy compliance, the kind of work that exists in the spaces between medicine and law, between what a hospital wants to do and what the federal government permits it to do. I had worked my way up from staff pharmacist to director of pharmacy compliance at a mid-sized regional hospital system in central Ohio, 3 campuses, 2 outpatient clinics, and a behavioral health unit that required its own separate set of licensing considerations. The work was not glamorous. Nobody made a movie about a man who spent his Saturday afternoons reviewing DEA Form 222s for discrepancies. My wife used to joke that I was the only person she knew who got excited about the renewal cycle for a Schedule 3 dispensing authorization. She wasn't wrong. I loved it. Not because it was exciting, but because it mattered. Because somewhere in that stack of paperwork was the reason a surgery patient received the right medication at the right dose at the right time, and not a fraction more. I had accumulated over those years 26 individual federal authorizations tied to my DEA registrant number, not the hospital, not the health system. To me, my name, my credentials, my professional license as the pharmacist of record on documents that governed how controlled substances moved through 3 hospital campuses. This is not unusual in pharmacy compliance, though it is poorly understood by people who have never worked in it. A DEA registration belongs to a registrant. When a pharmacist in charge is the registrant of record for a facility, those authorizations are not automatically transferable to an institution. They travel with the individual, unless specific steps are taken, steps that require time, documentation, and the active cooperation of the person holding them. I knew this. My predecessor had explained it to me when I took the role. I had explained it to 2 hospital administrators over the years when the topic of succession planning came up. Those times, I was told it was on the roadmap. Those times, nothing happened. I filed it in the back of my mind and kept working. The merger happened in the spring of my 22nd year there. A larger health network out of Columbus acquired our system, and within 60 days, a new administrative layer arrived, like weather. Sudden, cold, and not particularly interested in what had been growing in the ground before it got there. The new chief operating officer was a man I'll call my new COO. He was 41, had an MBA from a school he mentioned in the first 10 minutes of every meeting, and had spent the previous 5 years turning what he described as legacy-dependent organizations into what he called scalable platforms. He said this with the same expression other people use when they talk about winning something. He was not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. He was a person who had learned a vocabulary that allowed him to make large decisions quickly without needing to understand the specifics of what was being decided. That is a different thing from being bad. It is, however, a dangerous thing in a regulated industry. Within his first month, he commissioned a resource optimization review. A consulting team came through, young people with laptops and lanyards, and a questionnaire that had clearly been designed for manufacturing facilities and then lightly adapted for healthcare. One of them sat in my office for 45 minutes and asked me to describe my core value deliverables. I walked her through the DEA registration structure, the controlled substance reporting requirements, the VAW accreditation I had built from scratch, the pharmacist in charge designations across 3 campuses. She typed notes and nodded, and at the end said, "So it's mostly documentation?" I said yes, mostly documentation. She thanked me and left. I found out later, much later, what she had written in her report. A colleague who had seen a printed copy told me that my entire function had been summarized as legacy compliance overhead with high substitution potential via integrated SaaS tooling, substitution potential. I thought about that phrase for a long time afterward. I thought about what it would take to substitute what I did, the 26 DEA registrations, the pharmacist in charge designations, the working relationship I had with our DEA diversion investigator, built over a decade of quarterly check-ins and zero deficiency audits, the institutional knowledge of where every controlled substance discrepancy in 3 years had originated and how we had resolved it before it became a reportable event. I thought, good luck. And then I thought, they're actually going to try. The alignment meeting was in a conference room on the 4th floor. My new COO was there. So was HR, a woman I had met twice who had the particular quality of appearing sympathetic while saying nothing sympathetic, and a man from the corporate compliance team who had driven up from Columbus and sat with his hands folded on the table like he was waiting for a church service to begin. They told me my position was being restructured, effective in 30 days. They were very kind about it. My new COO said he had tremendous respect for the work I had done building the compliance infrastructure, and that the organization was going to build on that foundation going forward with a centralized shared services model. He said the word foundation twice, which I noticed because people tend to repeat words when they are nervous. The HR woman slid a separation agreement across the table. 60 days of severance. Continuation of benefits for 90 days. A clause about cooperation during the transition period. I read it carefully. I signed nothing. I asked if I could take it home to review with my attorney. They said, of course, absolutely. Take all the time I needed. I thanked them, picked up my copy, and went back to my office. I sat at my desk for about 10 minutes. The DEA audit spreadsheet was still open on my screen. Column headers in blue. 17 entries still unreviewed. I saved the file, closed my laptop, and started making a list. I had known this was coming for about 6 weeks. Not because anyone had told me, because I knew how to read an organization the same way I had learned to read a controlled substance log by looking for what was missing, not just what was there. The consulting team's visit, the way my new COO's assistant had stopped scheduling me for leadership meetings, the job posting I had found on a healthcare staffing site for a pharmacy compliance manager at a rapidly growing Ohio-based health network with responsibilities that were a paraphrased version of my job description. I had started making phone calls. An old colleague of mine, a woman I had worked with 15 years ago before she left to join a competing hospital network in Western Ohio, had reached out to me twice over the past 2 years about coming over to her system. I had said no both times because I was comfortable, because I believed in what we were building, because I am the kind of person who stays. I called her the week after the consulting team left. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of the conversation, I had a verbal offer. It was formal within 3 weeks. The title was Vice President of Pharmacy Regulatory Affairs. The salary was 38% higher than what I was making. They were in the middle of a joint commission survey preparation cycle and needed someone who had done it before. I needed someone who wanted the kind of work I did. It felt, for the first time in months, like a conversation between equals. I did not sign the separation agreement for 11 days. I wanted to review it carefully. I also wanted to be certain of something before I did. Under federal law, when a pharmacist in charge who holds DEA registrations leaves a facility, there is a required notification process. The registrant, meaning me, must notify the DEA. The facility must apply for new registrations under a new responsible party. Until that process is complete, the facility's authority to dispense Schedule II controlled substances through those specific registration numbers is, at minimum, in a complicated legal position. I am not a lawyer. I want to be very precise here. I was not certain of every nuance of what would happen, but I had spent 22 years living inside this regulatory framework, and I knew that what I held was not simply a job title. It was a set of legal designations that did not evaporate when someone handed you a separation agreement. I called my attorney. We talked for 90 minutes. Then I signed the agreement with 2 modifications I requested in writing. They agreed to both within 24 hours. My last day was a Thursday. A few colleagues took me to lunch. One of them, a pharmacist I had hired and mentored for 9 years, cried a little and then apologized for crying, and I told her not to apologize. We ate at a diner near the hospital that had been there since 1987 and had the kind of pie case near the door that makes you feel like time works differently inside. I had the turkey club. She had soup. We talked about everything except work. That afternoon, I completed and submitted my DEA notification of change in responsible party status. This is a required filing. I was not doing anything unusual or strategic. I was following the law. I packed my office. 2 boxes. I had kept it sparse deliberately, not because I was planning to leave, but because I had always believed that the measure of a person's contribution was not how much they decorated their workspace. I drove home. My wife had made dinner, roast chicken, which is the meal she makes when she wants to say something without saying it. I told her I was fine. She said she knew. We watched 2 episodes of something neither of us can remember now and went to bed. I started my new position the following Monday. The drive was longer, 40 minutes instead of 12. I didn't mind. I put on a podcast about the history of the interstate highway system, which is the kind of thing I find genuinely interesting and have stopped apologizing for. By Wednesday of my first week, I was deep into their Joint Commission preparation. Their controlled substance documentation had gaps. Not dangerous ones. This was a well-run organization, but the kind of gaps that accumulate when nobody has made it their specific job to close them. I knew exactly what to look for and exactly what to do. It felt like coming home to a house you'd never been in, but had somehow always known the layout of. I heard what happened through a former colleague who still worked at my old hospital. She texted me on a Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks after I left. The DEA had been in contact. This was not a surprise to me, and it should not have been a surprise to anyone who understood how the registration system worked. When I filed my notification of change in responsible party status, it triggered a review of the facility's active registrations. The hospital had 26 DEA registration numbers that were tied to me as the registrant. Until those registrations were transferred to a new responsible party, a process that required a licensed pharmacist to apply, wait for DEA approval, and assume formal responsibility, the hospital was operating in a compliance gap on controlled substance dispensing. I want to be precise again. The hospital could still dispense medications. Patients were not in danger, but the legal framework around their Schedule II dispensing authority was in a condition that no compliance officer ever wants it to be in, particularly when the DEA sends a letter asking for documentation of your current pharmacist of record. From what I understood, my new COO had not been made aware of this possibility. The consulting team's report had not mentioned it. The shared services pharmacy compliance platform they had contracted with, a software company based in Atlanta that had a very clean website and apparently very little experience with DEA registration structure, had not flagged it either. The hospital's new pharmacy compliance manager, who had been hired 2 weeks after my departure and had a background primarily in retail pharmacy, reportedly asked 3 separate people in her first week what a DEA Form 222 was. My former colleague told me there had been a meeting. She was not in the meeting, but she had spoken to someone who was. My new COO had apparently stood up at some point and asked, loudly and with some emotion, how one person walking out the door could put 26 federal registrations in jeopardy. He was told that it was, in essence, how the system worked. He asked why no one had told him. There was a silence, my colleague said. The kind of silence that contains a very long answer that nobody in the room had the authority to give. I will not pretend that I felt nothing when I heard this. I am human. There was something, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of resolution. The feeling of a knot that has been pulled tight for a long time, finally releasing. I had spent 22 years caring about something that was, in the end, dismissed as documentation. I had tried, twice, to explain that the structure I maintained was not just paperwork, but legal infrastructure. Both times I had been thanked and redirected. The third time, I had been handed a separation agreement with a clause about cooperation during the transition. I had cooperated fully. I had filed every required notification. I had done everything the law required of me. I had simply done it as myself, as the person those registrations belonged to, and not as a favor to an institution that had decided I was overhead. The hospital resolved the situation. Of course they did. these things get resolved. It took them several months and, from what I understand, the engagement of a specialized healthcare regulatory consulting firm at significant cost. The new pharmacist of record eventually received her DEA registrations. The compliance gaps were closed. My new COO, I heard, departed the organization about 8 months after I did. The circumstances were described to me as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities, which is a sentence that can mean many things. I didn't think about it much. By then I had other things to occupy my mind. My first Joint Commission survey in the new role went well. No findings in controlled substance management. The surveyor, a retired hospital administrator from Minnesota, shook my hand at the end of the day and said our documentation was among the cleanest he had seen in 3 years of surveys. I thanked him. I meant it. My wife and I took a long weekend in the fall, something we hadn't done in years. We drove up to Put-in-Bay on Lake Erie, rented a small house for 3 nights, and did very little. She read. I walked along the water in the mornings and watched the boats. On the last evening we sat on the porch with glasses of wine, and she asked me if I missed it, the old job, the old hospital, the version of my life that had existed 12 months before. I thought about it honestly. I missed some of the people. I missed the specific way the light came through my office window in the late afternoon in January, when the days were short and the campus was quiet and I was alone with a spreadsheet and a cold cup of coffee and the knowledge that the work I was doing mattered, even if no one else in the building could have told you exactly why. I did not miss being called overhead. I told her, no, not really. She nodded, like she had already known the answer and had only asked because she wanted to hear me say it out loud. There is something I want to say to anyone who has ever sat in a meeting and heard their life's work described as a cost center, a redundancy, a legacy dependency, waiting to be optimized away. They are not wrong that you can be replaced. People can always be replaced, technically. The question is what it costs and what gets lost in the space between the person leaving and the system catching up to what that person actually was. I was not irreplaceable in any cosmic sense, I know that, but I had built something real over 22 years, a web of relationships, authorizations, institutional knowledge, and legal designations that did not live in a server or a software platform. It lived in my credentials, my judgment, and the trust that regulators had placed in me specifically. When I walked out the door, all of that walked out with me. Not because I planned it that way, because that is simply how it works. The lesson, if there is one, is not about revenge. I am not a vengeful person. The lesson is about understanding what you actually hold and making sure, if you ever find yourself in a room where someone is explaining that you are a line item, that you understand the difference between what they think they're cutting and what is actually attached to the wire they're about to pull. Know your registrations. Know your designations. Know which authorizations travel with you when you leave, and which ones the organization cannot simply reissue on a Tuesday morning. And if the people making the decision have never asked, if it has never once come up in any conversation about your role, keep that information close, not as a weapon, as a document. I drove to work this morning on a grey November Tuesday. The podcast was about the history of the Erie Canal, which turns out to be more interesting than it sounds. I had a thermos of coffee that my wife makes stronger than I would make it myself, which I have stopped mentioning because I have come to prefer it that way. I have a team now, 4 people, 2 pharmacists, a compliance coordinator, and an analyst fresh out of graduate school who reminds me, in the best possible way, of who I was 30 years ago. She asks questions about everything. She wants to understand not just what the regulation says, but why it was written, what failure it was responding to, what would happen if the requirement didn't exist. I take a lot of time with her questions. I know from experience that the answers matter more than anyone in a business school would tell you. My office faces east. In the winter, when I get in early enough, the sun comes through the window at a low angle and lights up the surface of my desk and everything on it. The stacked compliance manuals, the framed copy of my pharmacist license, the coffee thermos, the photograph my wife took of us at Put-in-Bay last fall. She is laughing at something in the photo. I don't remember what, but I remember that afternoon felt like being given something back that I hadn't realized I'd lost. It's a good office. I earned it the same way I earned everything else in this career. Slowly, carefully, and by never once treating the paperwork as optional. I've thought a lot about what made my new COO so certain I was expendable, and I don't think it was arrogance exactly. I think it was a particular kind of confidence that comes from never having had to understand something deeply before making a decision about it. He had built a career on seeing patterns from altitude, systems, platforms, optimization ratios. From up there, I probably did look like overhead. A middle-aged man in a mid-size Ohio hospital, maintaining spreadsheets and renewal cycles and relationships with federal regulators who sent letters instead of emails. Of course, a software platform could do that. What he couldn't see from altitude was what the spreadsheets were actually holding. That's the thing about expertise that takes decades to build. It becomes invisible to anyone who didn't watch it being constructed. My new COO saw the output, clean audits, zero deficiency findings, a controlled substance program that had never once produced a reportable event in 22 years. He did not see the 10,000 decisions underneath that record, the judgment calls, the 6 a.m. phone calls with DEA investigators, the institutional memory of every near miss and how we had quietly corrected it before it became something worse. He saw the surface and called it documentation. And I want to be honest here. There was a time when that would have broken something in me. When I was younger, I needed the recognition the way I needed the work itself. I wanted people to understand what I did, why it mattered, how much of the hospital's legal operating authority rested on a foundation I had built with 20 years of careful, unglamorous effort. I don't need that anymore, and I think that is the real thing I want to say. If this story has anything worth taking from it, there's a kind of integrity that only becomes visible under pressure, when something is taken from you, or when you are told that what you built has no value, and you have to decide what you actually believe about the work you've done. My new COO applied that pressure. He didn't mean to teach me anything, but he did. He taught me that I had built something real, that the 26 authorizations tied to my name were not incidental to my career. They were the record of it. Every one of those designations represented a moment when a federal agency or accreditation body looked at my credentials, my record, and my professional judgment and said, "We trust this person." That trust traveled with me when I left, not because I was trying to make a point, because trust, real trust, built over years of doing the right thing even when no one was watching, that doesn't stay behind when you walk out the door. It goes where you go. The consequences that followed were not something I engineered. They were simply the result of a decision being made without full information, by someone who had decided full information was unnecessary. That's the cause. The compliance gap was the effect. Systems work that way. Actions accumulate into outcomes. What I keep coming back to is this. The work was always real, even when the institution stopped treating it that way. The licenses were always mine, even when someone decided I was a line item, and the colleagues who trusted me, who asked good questions, who called to check in after I left. Those relationships were always the actual infrastructure. Paperwork expires, knowledge transfers, but the character you build doing honest, difficult, unglamorous work, that compounds quietly, year after year, until one day you find yourself sitting in a new office with a better title and the team that asks the right questions. And you realize that everything you thought you lost was actually just showing you where to go next. I drive 40 minutes to work now. I don't mind.